Welcome back. Today I'm going to attempt to record the second part of my lecture on Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Now, in the first part, I had explained that this is an occasional essay and Spivak is responding to an interview by Deleuze and Foucault, and that she has certain objections to some of the things that Deleuze and Foucault state. Today, I'm going to use and try to use the text of the essay itself and try to go line by line and see if I can handle the first part of the essay. Now, you are aware that there are 4 parts of the essay. The essay is organized. There are 4 parts. Part 1 is a critique of the Foucault-Deleuze interview, which I hope to cover in this lecture. Part 2 describes epistemic violence, the subaltern, and ends with the words on implications of what will happen if we actually bought into what Deleuze and Foucault say and followed it as intellectual. Part 3, she moves us into a discussion of Derrida in comparison to Foucault, because people often argue, she says, that Foucault writes about history and Derrida is ahistorical. What she's arguing is that the tools that Derrida gives us are actually more significant for people doing scholarship about the global periphery. And that's what she argues in part 3. And the part 4 is kind of the meat of her argument, because she takes us through the discussion of sati, its codification under the colonial law, and towards her final example of Bhuvan Sawari and her suicide. Right? These are the 4 parts of the essays, and at each stage, when I move from one part to the other, I'll try to explain as to why is she moving into a certain thought process. Okay, but first and foremost, I would like to point out in this lecture her main argument in the beginning of the essay and her main objections to the interview, and why does she choose the interview. That's the intent in this part, and I hope I can do justice to it. And if you just look at the first line, it tells us the whole project of this essay, because what she starts with is that some of the most radical criticism coming out of the West today is the result of an interested desire to conserve the subject of the West, or West as a subject. Okay, let's unpack that. So this role played by the intellectuals maybe unintentionally ends up preserving the subject of the Western intellectual, or West itself, without any acknowledgement of the complicating factors coming from the developing world. So the idea is that the Western intellectual, in the process of explaining things that could be relevant to the workers, is actually constituting their own location in the West as normative, and as maybe the only normative universal way of looking at it, without even knowing that they are doing that. The much publicized critique of the sovereign subject, she's talking now, thus actually inaugurates a subject. Okay, so the critique of the sovereign subject is a Foucauldian thing, right? He's the one who talks about that we don't act as subjects, but we produce subject effects. So the prophet of subject effects, Foucault, while talking about this particular subject in the interview, himself is inaugurating, a new subject of the West. And what does she argue? She says, I will argue for this conclusion by considering a text by 2 great practitioners. So this general tendency to create West as the subject, and the Western intellectual as the speaking subject, as the norm, she says, I will now prove this point by reading an interview by 2 scholars who are the prophets, so-called, of the periphery, right? Foucault and Deleuze. And then she gives us the reason why she has chosen an interview instead of their long, well thought out and planned works. She says, I've chosen this friendly exchange between two activist philosophers of history because it undoes the opposition between authoritative theoretical production and the unguarded practice of conversation, right? Thus enabling Spivak and others to trace the working of ideology, right? So the idea is that she's not reading their finished projects, which would be more deliberate and maybe would have less slippage of the ideology that has produced those two scholars, but to take this conversation, maybe informal, because it is informal, and that informality allows a scholar like Spivak to read into it as to what is it that these two scholars are expressing ideologically without even knowing as to where their assumptions are coming from. It's like when she discusses later tracking the silences of the text, right? Foucault and Deleuze are not saying this is who we are. They're expressing it. The ideology is showing through that informal expression through a conversation. Okay, so then she goes on and tells us about the critique of the sovereign subject, of which, of course, Foucault is a part. But she says that there are two things that come across very clearly in this interview, right? That this is a conversation with the Maoists. And another thing that comes up in this conversation is the workers' struggle, right? Now, obviously, in this discussion with the French Maoists, what Spivak points out is that you can't trace the original Maoism in it. It's French Maoism, which has got nothing to do with Maoism coming from China. And it eventually becomes French New Philosophy. And that these two scholars are also connecting their views to workers' struggle, which she says is a genuflection on the part of Deleuze. And why does she says that? She quotes Deleuze here. She says, we are unable to touch power in any points of its application without finding ourselves confronted by this diffuse mass, so that we are necessarily led to the desire to blow it up completely. Every partial revolutionary attack or defense is linked in this way to the workers' struggle, right? And Spivak says this is probably not sincere because it's like a genuflection. She's talking about the workers' struggle, but they don't connect it to the actual workers' struggle in the world, because in order to do that, these two intellectuals will have to incorporate in their thought process the global division of labor. That the workers' struggle is not uniform in France as well as in India and Bangladesh, right? That there is a global division of labor, right? And there are workers on the other end of the global divide who are caught within the web of capital, who are exploited, who have not gotten a chance of upward mobility to become part of the consumerist economy, right? And there is no way we can conflate the workers that Deleuze and Foucault are imagining with the workers on the other end of the global divide. So for these two scholars to make these claims, there is then an erasure of ideology itself, that we cannot talk about the workers' struggle without a general theory of ideology, and within that, without actually understanding the global division of labor. Now then she goes on the next pages, and I'm trying to bring the next page here is, she gives us a further critique of what Deleuze and Foucault are arguing. And one of the things that they argue is that in their interview is that theory is practice and practice is theory, right? And there is no signifier. What Spivak is then asking the question is that if that is so, right, And if desire leads us, and it doesn't lack anything according to Deleuze, right? It's not lack of its object, it is rather the subject that's lacking desire, right? That entire theory of desire by Deleuze. So, how do you then track the presence of the West's other in that theory of desire? So, what she's saying here is this may be the legal subject of socialized capital, neither labor nor management, holding a strong passport, using a strong or hard currency with supposedly unquestioned access to due process. It is certainly not the desiring subject as other. So the other or the desiring subject that Deleuze is theorizing and talking about cannot necessarily be universalized, and it certainly cannot be the desiring subject as the other, right? Because that subject cannot move about in the world with the freedom and facility in which the subject that Deleuze is theorizing moves about, right? We have to understand the existence of the other, and we can only understand it if we think of ideology and think of the global division of labor. Okay. Furthermore, she goes into, there is a certain disavowal of ideology in the interview. But the question that she's also asking is the question about representation, and that she brings up on page 71. Okay. And then she says that, okay, at one point, Deleuze's argument is that, um, there is no more representation. And I'm quoting is, there is nothing but action of theory and action of practice, which relate to each other as relays of networks, right? And what Deleuze is arguing is that the intellectual becomes transparent, right? And a relay, people know what they want, they relay to the intellectual, and the intellectual relays it forward, right? There is, Spivak is saying there is not even a critical understanding of what is being relayed. The critic has taken away that role itself, right? But then she goes into and saying, okay, what kind of representation are they talking about? If they're saying there is no representation, right? There are two possible definitions of representation, and those are Voltraitan, right? Represent in the first sense, right? Where you stand in for someone, you represent someone, maybe politically and other, and then Darstale, right? Representation in pictorial form, in art, right? And what she is saying is that you can't think that they both are the same, right? And in order for us to understand the global division of labor, we have to be very careful in defining what do we even mean by representation. And obviously, she takes us to Marx, because he's the one who's theorizing class, right? And class to him is people who share the same kind of lived experience but are cut off from other classes. But class is never natural, right? It is constructed because of the socio-economic conditions in which people exist. And if we are talking about representation of class, it will be Vertreten, right? Someone standing in for them. And she goes to, the famous essay, The 18th Borromeo of Louis Bonaparte, where Marx discussing the question of class, right? And especially for the Jewish citizens of France. And then in this part one, after she had discussed, and the reason she's discussing Marx here is because she's giving us how Marx theorizes class, and that understanding of class is crucial, and the distinction between two kinds of representations is crucial if Deleuze and Foucault are going to argue that representation has withered away, right? So further in this part, towards the end of it, what she says is and I quote, she says, "My view is that radical practice should attend to this double session of representation. It should know about World Trade, but also does trail," right? And Marx himself, she says, rehearses an ancient subterfuge in the concept of what Marx himself rehearses, and that post-structuralists, by erasing this distinction, right, then they can claim there is no sign structure operating experience. And does that mean, she says, we lay semiotics to rest? If there is no need of representation, right, what kind of representation is it? But then what is the role of the intellectual, right? Then she, on page 75 of my text, she goes on to discuss Said, right, and Said's insistence and critique of Foucault, where Said basically is talking about the importance of the intellectual and his or her role, right? And the reason she's taking us to Said is to assert that the intellectual should not abdicate his or her role of representing, especially the other of Europe, right? And then what will happen? She uses the term other as the self's shadow. I shall return to this argument shortly, she says, but this, if these French intellectuals can claim that representation has withered away, it has died, right? That people can speak for themselves, and they can offer these solutions normatively and almost universally, right? What is at stake? First of all, that the intellectuals need not to represent the people, represent in standing in for, right? And two, that everyone is constructed in the shadow of this self that is speaking, right? Right? And so the other of Europe then is constructed in the shadow of this European self, right? And if we do that, then we have to elide this entire lopsided global division of labor. And can we actually do that, right? That's her question in this part, that if we assume that representation is no longer necessary or no longer needed, what kind of representation are we talking about? If we are saying that the desire leads a person to the interest where it lies, whose desire are we talking about? Does this desire include the desire of the global other of Europe, the person on the other end of global divide, right? And that if we leave this question unattended, aren't we creating the other of Europe in its own shadow without even knowing that it could have a different subjectivity, a different existence, a different politics, right? So the question then at the end of this section it is what she's saying is that let's query into that, right? Let's question the question of a general ideology, global division of labor, and let's question the claims that these intellectuals are making on the plane of class, but also global division of labor, in which the views of these two privileged European intellectuals that are being offered as definitive stance on representation and signification and role of the intellectuals, what would be at stake if we, I mean, the developing world intellectuals, the third world intellectuals, the post-colonialists, uncritically bought into it and believed that people or subalterns can speak for themselves and there is no need for us to represent them. So that is the groundwork that she is laying down in part one of Can the Subaltern Speak, right? And now, I know I've not done a good job of explaining it, but I was trying to go line by line. So with this brief knowledge and my concluding thoughts on it, we will then move on to part two of the essay, as I explained, and see if we can understand her argument better, right? How does she make her point? Remember, She's trying to prove in the very beginning of this essay that in the process of discussing the subject, a new practice is happening in post-structuralism, and that is the solidification of the subject of Europe and Europe as a subject itself. The interview that is using is an example of how it happens. And the critique is, why is it necessary to challenge that creation of Europe as a subject, or the subject of Europe as an intellectual? I hope this was helpful to you, and I'll soon come back with part 3 of my attempt at trying to discuss Can the Subaltern Speak. Until then, thank you so much, and peace and love.